Canadian news could soon disappear from Canadians' Google searches and their Facebook and Instagram feeds. It's in response to Bill C-18 recently passed. It forces tech giants to pay media companies for the content they link to.
Money is going to the big tech. And so there has to be regulations. We have to make sure that they pay their fair share. That's all we're asking. And we hope that we can move forward with that.
But Meta says they will begin to block content soon, which would include content on Facebook and Instagram.
The way the bill is drafted doesn't allow for negotiations outside the framework of the legislation. So there are no negotiations currently. We are proceeding towards ending the availability of news permanently in Canada. We wish we weren't here, but we are here. And there is really nothing at this point that's going to alter that trajectory.
My next guest is a vocal critic of digital giants like Meta and Google and a public supporter of the measures in Bill C-18. Jason Kint is the CEO of Digital Content Next, a trade association that represents digital content creators, including companies like the New York Times, NPR, Politico, and many others. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me, David.
So Meta and Google say they aren't bluffing here when it comes to banning news content, but you see this as just a negotiation tactic. What makes you say that?
That's right. Well, first off, we watched this play out in Australia with a very similar legislation, and the two companies were very, very clear in their strategy to try to intimidate Parliament and back them off. And so we're seeing that play out, almost the exact same playbook in Canada, maybe a little bit more aggressive. And they've got a period now of about 6 months where the regulations still need to be written. And so they've created a lot of media storm and excitement, dangling that the revenues could go away for the news publishers and that the traffic could go away. And so this is, to us, an intimidation tactic, and really probably not focused just on Canada, unfortunately for Canada, but focused on the globe at large, because they don't want this legislation moving to other countries too.
Okay, so there's a few threads there I want to pull at, but let's start with Australia, because that's the example that keeps getting cited. And Meta and Google, what they have said is that the legislation here in Canada is tougher and different than what they face in Australia, and it exposes them to a broader, uncapped financial liability, and they say that's a risk they're not willing to take. Is the law as in Canada that much worse for them than what we saw in Australia?
Only in that the Canadian media market's a little bit bigger than Australia, so maybe let's call it 50% more that they might have at risk that in payments for news publishers. But other than that, the law is very similar. There's some technical differences in terms of how they get designated and when they get designated that they'll, I'm sure, call out to you, but it's relatively the same effects.
Okay, so if this is a bargaining tactic, as you believe, how should the government of Canada proceed? Because you've got a lot of nervous news publishers right now who are facing being knocked off the world's most powerful search engine and its biggest social media platform. What should the government of Canada do?
I think proceed full speed ahead. I think they've shown a level of both bravery against the intimidation tactics that have been playing out for more than a year. I think they've been willing and probably humble enough to kind of say, hey, let's study what happened in Australia and make sure we learn from that. And they've improved on the legislation in a couple minor ways. And so I think they just need to be full speed ahead and recognize that, yes, Facebook may well block access. They haven't done it yet, but sometime in the 6 months, as regulations play out, they may block access. I think that will have a negative effect on Facebook as a business. And then Google, I hesitate to believe they really will follow through with it. I think there's a larger risk to Google as a platform, but I think the government should be absolutely full speed ahead. And I think the world should be supporting them. We're all watching and we're all studying, and you have to stand up to these two companies that effectively have a duopoly in the digital advertising market. And there's entirely an imbalance in bargaining power. It's playing out in antitrust lawsuits here in the US by all of our authorities, bipartisan across our state AGs. It's playing out in Europe right now. Everyone globally recognizes that there's an imbalance in power here. And Canada, to their credit, has moved forward with smart legislation. They need to be full speed ahead.
Okay, but as if they go full speed ahead, and that's certainly the indication we get from the Heritage Minister, Pablo Rodriguez, when he speaks about this, and say the companies aren't bluffing. What about the media companies caught in the middle here? We've heard from some of the people in the digital publishing space that this is essentially existential for them, and that losing Facebook, for example, could flat out kill them as a company.
Yeah, I've heard that too from some small publishers. Ironically, the legislation probably helps small publishers more than any. That's what happened in Australia. It was the small publishers that got more revenue per journalist, per reporter, and the legislation allows them to collectively bargain together. So it should be even better for small publishers. But that threat, if Google and Facebook play it out, there is a risk to traffic to them. If they're valuable and they're differentiated, users will speak up. Users will find other ways to get to them. And I think this, again, is a intermediary step to try to stop the companies from having to deal with similar legislation in the US. We have to remember that in the US, where I said Canada might be 50% larger than Australia, the US, it might be 20 times as large. And so that's the real ball game here for the two companies.
But that really seems to be it, right? They're fighting the battle here, so they don't have to fight it there in the United States or deal with it in a larger way in Europe. I mean, what are the knock-on effects for Facebook and Google potentially if Canada goes ahead with this and they eventually end up complying with the law?
Yeah, and the effects on really it's different for the two companies. Facebook, you've got a social media platform that has been ridiculed for years for having kind of disinformation and low quality content flowing around it. And so they would effectively be blocking out the signal and only left with the noise, right? So the garbage would still be there, but they'd be blocking out access to premium publishers and reputable news sources. And they'd be giving users an experience where every time they try to share a piece of news, they had some sort of bad experience where the content can't be shared, and I don't think the users will even understand why. And so that's Facebook. And then on the Google side, and really for both companies, I should say, they get an enormous amount of their power from collecting data across publisher websites. So they're able to crawl the sites. You probably have been talking a lot about, and people have been hearing about artificial intelligence and the race there. They get that information, that intelligence, by scraping publisher sites. So it's not just about the links to publishers, which is what the two companies would like to make it about, but it's also about the information they're able to glean from crawling the web, from harvesting user data, from dominating the advertising market. So all of those things are at risk if they put up a wall and users can't get access to news publishers and they can't effectively crawl that information.
So what do you think happens next? I mean, the government has said it's not going to be bullied by international companies, and Meta and Google has said they're just not going to enter into a regime that puts an uncapped financial liability on their books. I mean, what are you watching for next in this?
Well, it doesn't put an uncapped financial liability on the books, so I think we need to call out the myths out there. It didn't break the internet in Australia. And the only thing that was different about Australia was on the other side of the world. So a lot of the press weren't able to dig into it and really call out those myths. In Canada, we need to make sure that the reporting is good on what's playing out, that we break those myths here in the North America area in the media market. And they're going to proceed forward with the regulations. Google and Facebook will have a chance to participate, by the way, in that process, along with everyone else. And they're going to write regulations that conform to the law that was passed through the democratic process. And so, either Google and Facebook kind of follow through on what the new law is and this adjustment to bargaining power that intends to recalibrate and participate and actually, be respectful of the importance of the free and plural press, or they're going to, use this as a way to try to send a signal in a very, very aggressive way to the rest of the world. And I think that will harm the information environment in Canada. And I'm sorry that that's the repercussion there, because unfortunately, it's all about their profits at that point.